There is a moment that every underwater photographer knows well. You descend below the surface, the noise of the world above fades away, and suddenly you are surrounded by an entirely different universe. Colors shift, light bends, and life moves in ways that feel almost impossible to capture. Suzi Scuba has spent years mastering this exact challenge, and her approach to underwater photography is nothing short of transformative. Whether you are a beginner strapping on a camera housing for the first time, or an experienced diver looking to sharpen your skills, the techniques she has developed through countless dives offer a roadmap to capturing images that genuinely stop people in their tracks. Underwater photography is not simply about pointing a camera at something beautiful and pressing a button. It demands an understanding of physics, biology, patience, and artistry all at once. The water itself becomes both your medium and your obstacle, and learning to work with it rather than against it is the foundation of everything Suzi teaches. Light behaves in a completely different way the moment it enters water. Within just a few meters of depth, red wavelengths begin to disappear, followed by orange and yellow, leaving everything with a cold blue or green cast. This is the single biggest challenge underwater photographers face, and Suzi addresses it head-on. She emphasizes that understanding color loss is not just a technical detail, but a creative decision. Shooting at shallow depths, typically between 3 and 10 meters, allows you to retain more natural color and warmth in your images. When you go deeper, you need to compensate. Suzi recommends always shooting with strobes, which are underwater flash units, rather than relying solely on ambient light. Strobes restore the colors that water absorbs and bring subjects to life in ways that natural light simply cannot achieve at depth. The positioning of your strobes matters enormously. Placing them too close to the lens creates backscatter, which are those distracting white particles that appear when light reflects off suspended particles in the water. Suzi's preferred technique is to position strobes wide and slightly behind the camera housing, angling them inward toward the subject. This approach dramatically reduces backscatter while still flooding the subject with rich, even light. She also encourages photographers to experiment with a single strobe for more dramatic, directional lighting, especially when shooting macro subjects where shadows can add incredible depth and texture. Getting your camera settings right before you enter the water is absolutely critical, because adjusting them mid-dive is far more difficult than it sounds. Suzi recommends shooting in RAW format whenever possible, as this gives you far greater flexibility during post-processing to recover colors, adjust exposure, and fine-tune white balance. For most reef and wide-angle shooting, she starts with an aperture of around f8 to f11, which provides a solid depth of field while still allowing enough light to reach the sensor. Shutter speed is typically set between 1/100th and 1/200th of a second to freeze motion without cutting off the strobe sync. ISO should be kept as low as possible, usually between 100 and 400, to minimize noise in the final image. However, Suzi is quick to point out that rules are made to be broken. In low visibility conditions or when shooting fast-moving subjects like dolphins or sharks, you may need to push your ISO higher and open your aperture wider to capture the moment. Camera housing selection is another area Suzi feels strongly about. A quality housing that fits your specific camera model is non-negotiable. She advises always performing a dry test before every dive, submerging the empty housing in a bucket of water to check for leaks before trusting it with your camera. O-rings should be inspected, cleaned, and lightly lubricated before every single dive without exception. Composition underwater follows many of the same principles as surface photography, but with a few critical differences. Suzi is a strong advocate for getting low. Shooting upward toward your subject with the water column or the surface in the background creates a sense of depth and drama that shooting downward simply cannot replicate. This technique, often called the over-under or blue water background approach, gives your images a sense of scale and environment that immediately draws the viewer in. The rule of thirds applies just as powerfully underwater as it does on land. Placing your subject off-center, allowing negative space to breathe around it, creates a more dynamic and visually interesting image than centering everything in the frame. Suzi also emphasizes the importance of filling the frame when shooting macro subjects. Getting close, then getting closer still, eliminates distracting backgrounds and forces the viewer to engage with the intricate details of a tiny nudibranch, a shrimp, or a seahorse. One of the most underrated composition techniques Suzi teaches is the use of natural framing. Coral arches, sea fans, and rock formations can all serve as natural frames that draw the eye toward your subject and add layers of visual interest to the image. She encourages photographers to slow down, look around, and think about the entire frame rather than rushing to capture the first interesting thing they see. The relationship between an underwater photographer and the marine life they photograph is one that Suzi takes extremely seriously. She is vocal about the ethical responsibility that comes with entering the ocean as a guest. Chasing, touching, or disturbing marine life to get a better shot is not only harmful to the animals and their environment, but also produces worse images. Animals that feel threatened become erratic and unpredictable, making them far harder to photograph well. The best underwater images come from patience and stillness. Suzi teaches her students to approach subjects slowly, neutralize their buoyancy completely, and wait. When an animal becomes comfortable with your presence, it begins to behave naturally, and that is when the truly extraordinary moments happen. A turtle feeding on seagrass, a lionfish fanning its fins in a territorial display, an octopus changing color as it moves across the reef. These are the images that tell stories, and they only happen when the photographer has earned the trust of the subject through respectful, unhurried behavior. Buoyancy control is therefore not just a safety skill, but a photographic one. Suzi recommends dedicated buoyancy practice dives specifically aimed at achieving perfect neutral buoyancy before attempting serious photography. A photographer who is constantly fighting to stay in position will never capture the steady, deliberate shots that define great underwater imagery. The work does not end when you surface. Post-processing is where good underwater images become great ones, and Suzi approaches this stage with the same level of care and intention she brings to the dive itself. Because water absorbs color so aggressively, even well-exposed raw files often need significant color correction. Suzi begins every edit by adjusting white balance, warming the image to restore the reds and oranges that water has stolen. She then works on exposure and contrast, being careful not to blow out highlights in the water column or crush shadows in the darker areas of the reef. Clarity and texture sliders can be used sparingly to bring out the fine details in coral and marine life without making the image look overprocessed or artificial. One of Suzi's most important post-processing tips is to resist the urge to oversaturate. It is tempting to push colors to extreme levels to compensate for the muted tones of deep water, but images that are too saturated quickly begin to look unnatural and garish. The goal is to restore what was actually there, not to invent something that was not. She also encourages photographers to develop a consistent editing style over time, one that reflects their personal vision and makes their portfolio immediately recognizable. Underwater photography is ultimately an art form, and like all art forms, it rewards those who bring their own perspective, curiosity, and genuine love for the world they are documenting. The ocean has endless stories to tell, and with the right skills and the right mindset, your camera becomes the tool that brings those stories to the surface.